Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be discussing the Hindu newspaper dated 21st of October 2019 of the New Delhi edition. Now the topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now this particular lead article has been written by Mr. Shyam Saran, who is the ex-foreign secretary to the government of India. Now before analyzing this particular article, let us first look into its background. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because of the recent second informal summit between the Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President. Undoubtedly, these informal summits between the two leaders have been able to diffuse the tensions between the two countries. For instance, the first Wuhan informal summit was able to diffuse the tensions between the two countries which arose because of the Doklam crisis. On similar lines, the second informal summit between the two leaders was able to diffuse the tensions between the two countries which arose because of the China's stand on India's revocation of the special status of J&K. Now, this particular lead article highlights that these informal summits can be considered to be a positive development in fostering the bilateral relationship between the two countries. However, it would be wrong to attach too much of significance to these informal summits. This is because, first and foremost, these informal summits which are called between the two leaders were not expected to resolve the existing disputes. Rather, these informal summits were basically called in order to ensure that the existing differences as such do not turn into disputes in future. Secondly, the unipolar world dominated by USA is slowly turning into a bipolar world because of the growing dominance of China in terms of economic, political as well as geostrategic clout across the world. So the growing economic, political and geostrategic clout of China has led to Chinese dominance over India in terms of a number of spheres. Because of which, if you look at the nature of relationship between China and India, it is presently a form of asymmetric relationship where China enjoys a greater dominance over India in a number of spheres. Now, what this essentially means is that the relationship between the two countries is not of equals. Rather, this particular relationship is defined by a greater amount of Chinese dominance over India in certain crucial aspects. It is against this particular backdrop here, this particular lead article has given a number of suggestions for India so as to change this asymmetric relationship into a kind of symmetric relationship between India and China. So this particular lead article has given a number of suggestions as to how India has to reorient its policies in order to ensure that it does not live in a China-dominated global order. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we'll look into the nature of relationship between India and China, the overall strategy of China towards India. Thirdly, why should India not attach too much of significance to these informal summits? And lastly, what policy options should India adopt in order to ensure that it does not live in a global order dominated by China? Let us start analyzing these aspects of the article one by one. If you look at the nature of relationship between India and China, it can be defined in terms of three C's, that is cooperation, competition and conflict. With respect to cooperation, the first aspect of cooperation can be seen with respect to the reform of the global governance architecture, that is, the reform in the global financial institutions such as the IMF, World Bank, etc. Now, both India as well as China believe that these global financial institutions have to be reformed in order to give more amount of voting rights to the developing countries. And accordingly, both these countries are cooperating with each other so as to reform the global governance architecture. Similarly, both India and China believe that it is the developed countries that are responsible for the historical emission of greenhouse gases, and accordingly, the onus or the responsibility of providing the climate finance should rest on the developed economies. In other words, both India and China believe in the concept of the common but differentiated responsibilities. Hence, in order to promote greater amount of cooperation between the developing countries with respect to climate change talks, India and China have established a grouping known as the BASIC, which basically comprises of Brazil, South Africa, India as well as China. Both India and China share similar interests and concerns with respect to promotion of the global trade. It is to be noted that the present trade war, which has been initiated by USA, has not only adversely affected the Chinese economy, it has adversely affected even the Indian economy as well. Hence, there is a greater amount of scope for cooperation between India and China with respect to WTO trade negotiations. It is to be noted that both India as well as China are considered to be the leaders of the G33, which is a group under the WTO, so as to protect the interest of the developing as well as the least developed economies. Fourthly, both India as well as China are concerned about the prevailing security situation in the AFPAC region, which has emerged as a hotbed of the terrorism in the Indian subcontinent. Just like how the AFPAC region poses an adverse security challenge for India, looking from the perspective of Jammu and Kashmir, on similar lines, the AFPAC region poses a security concern from China with respect to its Xinjiang province. Hence, there is a greater scope of cooperation between India and China in order to handle the volatile security situation in the Indian subcontinent. And lastly, both India and China collaborate with each other on a number of international platforms such as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the G33, which is basically a grouping of countries under the WTO in order to protect the interest of the developing and least developed economies. The basic grouping, which is a grouping of the countries in order to protect the interests of the developing countries with respect to the climate change talks. With respect to competition between India and China, both India and China are considered to be the economic giants of the world. Now, presently, India's GDP size of $2.7 trillion is much lower than China's GDP size of $13.6 trillion. However, frequent comparisons are drawn between the GDP growth rates of these two countries. Both these countries compete with each other for getting the tag of the world's fastest emerging economy. Hence, there is a competition between India and China with respect to increasing their economic sizes. On similar lines, India and China have sought to increase their influences in the Indian Ocean region, where China has come out with the string of pearls strategy, and in response, Indian government has come out with the security and growth for all in the region, which stands for the Sagar initiative. Now, as part of the string of pearls, the Chinese government has constructed a number of ports such as the Gwadar port in Pakistan, Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, or for that matter, the Chittagong port in Bangladesh. In response, the Indian government has come up with a Sagar initiative so as to combat the growing influence of China in the Indian Ocean region. Another aspect of competition between India and China can be seen with respect to engagement of these two countries in the neighborhood, wherein both India as well as China have sought to enhance their political, economic and people-to-people contact with various countries such as Bangladesh, Myanmar as well as Nepal. So overall, it can be stated that both these countries are vying with each other so as to enhance their footprint in the neighboring countries. The next aspect of competition between India and China can be seen with respect to their engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, the Indian government has come up with the Act East policy so as to promote the multifaceted relationship with the East Asian economies. On the other hand, China sees itself as a leader of the Indo-Pacific region and is presently involved in a number of maritime disputes with the Southeast Asian economies. For instance, China has laid claim over the entire South China Sea. So the maritime disputes in the South China Sea would end up adversely affecting India's trade relationship with the countries based in Southeast Asia as well as East Asia. So one can see that China as well as India are competing in terms of a number of spheres. With respect to conflict between India as well as China, the bonhomie between India and China during the early years of Indian independence no longer exists. The 1954 Panchsheel Treaty has failed to resolve their bilateral disputes, because of which India and China are involved in a number of border disputes which can be seen in Chinese occupation of Aksai Chin region, the Chinese claim over Arunachal Pradesh, wherein China has been claiming that the large parts of the Indian territory in Arunachal Pradesh is part of Tibet and it calls Arunachal Pradesh as the southern Tibet. Similarly, both India and China had recently had a standoff over the Doklam crisis. Similarly, both these countries had a recent standoff over the Doklam, which lies at the tri-junction of India, China and Bhutan. The second nature of conflict between India and China can be seen with respect to Chinese involvement in the POK region through the construction of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Now, India believes that the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor goes against the territorial integrity of the Indian Union. On similar lines, China has repeatedly refused India's membership to some of the international organizations such as the United Nations Security Council or the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And lastly, China has been providing the diplomatic, economic, and military support to Pakistan in spite of the fact that Pakistan has emerged as the major sponsor of terrorism in the Indian subcontinent. China's support to Pakistan can also be seen with respect to the Chinese opposition to declaring Masood Azhar as a terrorist by the United Nations Security Council. It was only recently that China has changed its stance with respect to declaring Masood Azhar as a terrorist by the United Nations Security Council. Similarly, China has been supporting Pakistan in order to ensure that Pakistan is not blacklisted by the Financial Action Task Force. So, based upon these three aspects of the India-China relationship, that is cooperation, competition, and conflict, we can analyze as to what exactly is China's strategy towards India. Overall, the China strategy towards India is based upon neutralization. So, what exactly is this neutralization strategy of China towards India? The first facet of the neutralization strategy is that China is preventing India from following those policies which are against the Chinese interest. In other words, China is ensuring that India should not follow any kind of policy which goes against the interest of the China. On the other hand, China is clearly following a number of policies which goes against the interest of India. Now, with respect to first aspect, for example, the Vietnamese government had offered the exploration of two oil blocks in the South China Sea to ONGC Videsh Limited. However, since China claims that the entire South China Sea belongs to it, it has been pressurizing India to give up the exploration of oil block. Now, being an energy hungry country, India needs to explore the oil blocks in other countries and ensure its energy security. However, because of the Chinese pressure, India has been postponing the exploration of the oil block in the South China Sea. This clearly shows that Indian government has taken into account the interest and concerns which have been raised by the Chinese government with respect to the exploration of the oil block in the South China Sea. Secondly, India presently carries out the annual Malabar naval exercises with the navies of Japan as well as USA. Now, the Indian government had sought to expand the Malabar naval exercises by including other countries such as Australia. However, due to the Chinese concerns, India has decided to keep Australia out of the Malabar exercises. Similarly, India, Australia, Japan as well as USA had decided to form the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue known as Quad in order to ensure peace and security in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, China saw this particular grouping as a coalition of countries in order to counter the growing influence of China in the region. Initially, because of the Chinese concerns, India decided to remain outside the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. It was only recently in 2017 that India decided to join the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Lastly, it can also be seen that India has so far not officially expressed any types of concerns with respect to Chinese crackdown on the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. Now, this was basically done keeping in mind China's sensitivity towards the Hong Kong issue. However, China has sought to internationalize the Jammu and Kashmir issue. Hence, the very fact that China has not taken into account India's concerns on J&K issue shows Chinese insensitivity towards India. So, all these points here clearly highlight that China has been preventing India from following those policies which are against its interest. However, China has been following precisely those policies which goes against the India's interest. This can be seen with respect to the Chinese involvement in China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, Chinese opposition to the India's membership of the United Nations Security Council or the Nuclear Suppliers Group, or China's support to the Masood Azhar. Now, looking at China's strategy towards India, it can be highlighted that the nature of relationship between China and India is that of an asymmetric relationship, wherein China enjoys a greater amount of dominance over India. It can also be seen that India has taken the Chinese interests and concerns into account while engaging with the other countries. However, China has precisely done the opposite, wherein some of its policies are clearly against the India's interests. This is precisely the reason the article highlights that it would be wrong to attach too much of significance to these informal summits. At most, these informal summits provide a platform to the leaders of both the countries to highlight to the world that both India and China are mature enough to handle their disputes in an amicable manner. So keeping in mind China's strategy towards India, let us now understand as to what should be the India's strategy towards China in order to ensure that the asymmetric relationship between the two countries turns into a form of the symmetric relationship. Now coming to options before India, first and foremost, as we have discussed before, presently India's GDP size of $2.7 trillion is much lower than China's GDP size of $13.6 trillion. The higher GDP size of China has enabled China to enjoy a much greater economic dominance over India. Apart from that, the economic dominance enjoyed by China has enabled China to take a number of initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative as well as the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and these two initiatives have clearly gone against India's interest in the Indian subcontinent. Hence, first and foremost, India has to focus on enhancing its GDP size and it must try to reduce the differences in the GDP sizes between the two countries. So, a sustained GDP growth and development in case of India would enable the Indian economy to catch up with the Chinese economy. So, overall, the idea here is that the growing economic clout of India will make China more sensitive towards India's interest and concerns. Now, this is because if you look at the GDP growth rates of the Indian economy between the years 2003 to 2007, the GDP growth rates of the Indian economy was much higher than the GDP growth rate of the Chinese economy. Hence, the very fact that the Indian economy was growing at a rate which was much higher than the Chinese GDP growth rate made China more sensitive towards India's interests and concerns. Hence, it is expected that if India is able to increase its GDP size and reduce the GDP difference between the Indian economy and Chinese economy, China automatically will become more sensitive towards India's interests and concerns. Secondly, in order to ensure that China does not take a stand which goes against the India's interest, the Indian government has to use some form of leverage or a strategic edge over China. As to what exactly these leverages can be, first and foremost, if you look at the Chinese companies such as Oppo, Vivo, OnePlus, etc., have already established their dominance in the India's domestic market. Now, these companies are making huge amount of profits by exporting their smartphones to India. Now, India can cleverly use this as a leverage point in order to ensure that China takes into account the India's interests and concerns. Secondly, the Indian government is planning out the rollout of the 5G technology. However, if you look at the Chinese company Huawei, this particular company has come under immense pressure from the USA government. Hence, this particular company is in a desperate need to make an entry into the Indian domestic market. Hence, this particular desperation by the Chinese company to make an entry into Indian domestic market can be in turn leveraged by the Indian government. Nextly, the article highlights that China has already taken a lead over India with respect to expanding its footprint in India's neighborhood. So accordingly, India has to focus more on its neighborhood by emphasizing on the enhanced physical connectivity as well as and by pushing for the greater amount of economic integration with the countries in the neighborhood. And ideally, over a period of time, the Indian economy as such has to become the engine of growth for the entire Indian subcontinent. And lastly, the article highlights that the government of India has to make certain difficult choices with respect to some of these difficult choices which the government should possibly take here include, first and foremost, it has to bring Australia into the annual Malabar exercises. Secondly, India must proactively engage with the Quad grouping so as to counter the growing Chinese influence in the region. Now, based upon a video analysis, a main question for your practice here could be, China enjoys economic, political and geostrategic dominance over India, leading to a form of asymmetric bilateral relationship. In this regard, discuss as to how India should shape its future policies towards China to change this relationship into symmetric relationship. Now, the next article appears on page number 10. The title of the article is A Time-Tested Way to Trade Away the Conflict. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2 International Relations under the subsection India and its neighborhood relations. The bilateral trade between the two countries is considered to be significant not just for promoting the economic integration between the two countries. It also has the necessary ability to reduce the tensions between the two countries and take the relationship between them to a multifaceted level. This is because the increase in the bilateral trade between the two countries enhances the mutual trust between the two countries and this in turn fosters a greater amount of people-to-people contact. Hence, the mutual trust as well as people-to-people contact, which is built through the increase in bilateral trade, in turn helps to reduce the bilateral tensions between the two countries. And the decrease in the tensions between the two countries in turn fosters a greater amount of bilateral trade. Hence, it can be seen that the increase in the bilateral trade reduces the tension between the two countries, and this can be considered to be a form of the virtuous cycle. Now, such a classical case can be seen with respect to India's relationship with USA, wherein the amount of bilateral trade between the two countries has increased to an exponential level. And this increase in the bilateral trade has in turn enabled India and USA to cooperate with each other on a number of global issues. Now, keeping this philosophy of enhancing the trade relations so as to reduce the tensions between the two countries, India had initiated the cross-LOC trade between J&K and Pak-occupied Kashmir. Now, this particular cross-LOC trade was initiated almost a decade back on this particular day, that is October 21st, 2008. However, the cross-LOC trade was suspended by India in April 2019 after reports emerged that certain elements from across the border were misusing the cross-LOC trade to smuggle the weapons, drugs and fake currency into India. In this regard, this particular article here argues for restarting the cross-LOC trade with certain safeguards. Now, as part of this video analysis, we'll understand as to what is the significance of this cross-LOC trade, the various challenges with respect to the cross-LOC trade, and what strategy should India adopt in order to restart the cross-LOC trade. Let us start analyzing these aspects of the article one by one. As stated before, the cross-LOC trade was initiated actually on October 21st, 2008 between Jammu and Kashmir and Pak-occupied Kashmir. Now, this particular cross-LOC trade used to take place along which happened to be Uri-Muzaffarabad route as well as the Punch-Rawalkot route. Please note that the cross-LOC trade was actually a barter trade of certain selected goods without any exchange of money. With respect to significance of the cross-LOC trade, apart from fostering the bilateral trade between India and Pakistan, the cross-LOC trade was also devised as a mechanism to reunite the divided families in J&K with the POK region. Hence, the cross-LOC trade was considered to be one of the confidence-building measures undertaken by Indian and Pakistan government. Moreover, between the years 2008 to 2018, goods worth 7,500 crores were traded between the two countries, leading to almost around 1.7 lakh job day creation. Further, it was also stated that the increase in the bilateral trade had in turn fostered peace in the region. Now, in spite of these advantages associated with the cross-LOC trade, the LOC trade was not free from controversies. This is because some of the traders from across the border were misusing the cross-LOC trade for smuggling of the arms, narcotics and fake currency. And thus, it was stated that the traders were indirectly supporting the terror elements in the POK region. And this had in turn raised the security concerns for India, because of which India decided to discontinue the cross-LOC trade in April 2019. Now, coming to the challenges with respect to cross-LOC trade, first and foremost, the very fact that the present LOC trade is a form of barter trade has in turn hindered the full development of the cross-LOC trade. And secondly, only certain selected commodities were allowed to be traded across the LOC, because of which the overall volume of trade remained quite marginal. Secondly, as highlighted before, a number of security concerns were raised with respect to the cross-LOC trade, wherein some of the traders from across the border were misusing the LOC trade for smuggling of the arms, narcotics as well as fake currency. Thirdly, when the LOC trade was initiated, it was expected that only the goods originating from the respective regions will be traded. However, over a period of time, some of the third country origin goods such as the California almonds also came to be traded across the LOC. And lastly, we have to realize that the overall trade relationship between the two countries in turn depends upon the friendly relationship which exists between the two countries. However, if you look at the nature of relationship between India and Pakistan, the relationship between the two countries is considered to be quite hostile, because of which it has hindered the full-scale development of the cross-LOC trade. Now, this particular article highlights that considering the prevailing situation in J&K, the Indian government has to come up with a revised strategy so as to initiate the cross-LOC trade. Now, as to what this revised strategy should basically include, first and foremost, the article has highlighted that globally countries across the world have adopted digitization of trade procedures as well as lower the human intervention in order to facilitate the international trade. and accordingly, the article highlights that India should adopt the same mechanism and it should provide for the digital platforms which can monitor the invoicing of goods, track the traders' records, the truck details, etc., so as to ensure the real-time checks on the misuse of trade. So the idea here is that by adopting digital platforms, we would be able to ensure that the cross LOC trade is not misused for the smuggling of arms, narcotics, or the fake currency. Secondly, the article has highlighted that presently there is lack of transparency in the cross LOC trade because of the absence of the standard operating procedures, and accordingly, the article has highlighted that we need to lay down the standard operating procedures which may be related to the registration of the traders, the norms related to GST, and to lay down the rules of origin so as to ensure that the third country goods are not traded across the LOC. Nextly, we need to impart a greater amount of training to the traders so as to ensure that the cross LOC trade is not misused. On similar lines, India can set up the trade monitoring cell consisting of the central and state government officials so as to monitor the cross LOC trade on a real-time basis. And lastly, India and Pakistan may set up a joint investigation team to investigate all the cases related to the smuggling of arms, narcotics, and fake currency. The article concludes by saying that by adopting such a revised strategy, the Indian government would be able to bring about a lasting peace in the J&K region. Now, the next article appears on page number 3. The title of the article is No Diwali Boom for the Green Crackers. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Environment under the subsection Conservation and Environmental Pollution. Apart from that, this particular article is also important because a related question has been asked in UPSC Mains 2015. The question here was, does the right to clean environment entail the legal regulations on burning crackers during the Diwali? Discussed in the light of Article 21 of the Indian Constitution and the judgments of the Apex Court. In the year 2015, due to the increase in the air pollution because of bursting of crackers, a host of petitions were filed before the Supreme Court of India, wherein these petitioners argued for a nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale and bursting of crackers, particularly during the Diwali. In response, in the year 2018, the Supreme Court of India issued a number of guidelines related to the manufacture, sale and bursting of crackers. More importantly, the Supreme Court of India stated that only the green crackers would have to be manufactured in India. Apart from that, it designated the Petroleum and Explosive Safety Organization, that is PESO, as a nodal agency in order to implement the guidelines of the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court guidelines related to the manufacture, sale and bursting of crackers has been comprehensively been covered in our DNS dated 24th of October 2018. Hence, I would suggest you to go through this particular DNS in order to comprehensively understand all the aspects related to the Supreme Court guidelines. Now, this particular article here highlights various implementation challenges with respect to the availability of green crackers in the Indian domestic market. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we'll understand as to what exactly are the green crackers, and secondly, we'll understand various implementation challenges with respect to the availability of green crackers in the Indian domestic market. According to the Supreme Court guidelines, the green crackers are essentially those crackers that should be able to reduce the emission of the particulate matter by 33 to 35%. The green crackers should also use the eco-friendly and biodegradable materials. More importantly, the Supreme Court of India has banned the usage of the barium salts in the crackers. It is to be noted that the barium salts which are normally used in the crackers give attractive green color when the crackers are burst. However, the barium salts are responsible for a number of the respiratory diseases among the people, and hence accordingly the Supreme Court of India has imposed a ban on the usage of the barium salts in the crackers. Now, with respect to implementation challenges for the availability of the green crackers in the Indian domestic market, presently as per the Supreme Court guidelines, the Petroleum and Explosive Safety Organization is required to issue licenses to the manufacturers for manufacturing the green crackers. However, presently only around 230 manufacturers in India have been issued a license for the manufacture of green crackers by the Petroleum and Explosive Safety Organization. Hence, because of the less number of licensed manufacturers of green crackers, presently there is a shortage of the green crackers in the Indian domestic market. Secondly, a large number of traders in India are deliberately not releasing the green crackers into the Indian domestic market so as to create the artificial scarcity. The idea is that this artificial scarcity would lead to the increase in the prices of crackers and thus benefiting the traders. The next challenge is with respect to the lack of awareness about the green crackers. Presently, the green crackers which are sold in the Indian domestic market are required to have a green logo on a hologram apart from having a QR code. However, most of the green crackers which are presently sold in the Indian market do not have either the green logo or the QR code. Apart from these factors, a large number of fake green crackers have also entered the domestic market. The next implementation challenge is that the green crackers are at least 30% costlier as compared to the conventional crackers. And lastly, as per the Supreme Court guidelines, the station house officers are required to ensure that only the genuine green crackers are sold in the market. However, the SHOs are finding it difficult to identify the fake green crackers which are presently sold in the market. Now, with respect to your prelims, what you are required to understand is that first and foremost you have to understand as to what exactly are the green crackers, and secondly you have to note that it is the Petroleum and Explosive Safety Organization which is required to implement the guidelines of the Supreme Court. Now, the next article appears on page number 11. The title of the article is A Case for Abjuring the Custodial Interrogation. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Governance under the subsection Features of Indian Constitution. Now, before analyzing this particular article, let us first look into its background. Article 20 Clause 3, which is one of the fundamental rights provided under the Indian Constitution, provides that no person who is accused of any kind of offences shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. Now, this simply means that if a person who has committed a crime is arrested by the police, such a person cannot be compelled to give any kind of evidences before the police. Now, this particular fundamental right is more broad-based and in turn includes a number of rights for the accused as well. First and foremost, a person who is accused of any offense cannot be forced to give any kind of confession statement. Any kind of forced confession statement given by an accused is not admissible in a court of law as an evidence against the accused person. Under the Indian Evidence Act, any kind of forced confession statement is not admissible in a court of law in order to implicate the accused person. Secondly, a person who is accused of any offences cannot be compelled to give either the oral or the documentary evidences. And one of the most important aspect of this particular fundamental right is that this fundamental right gives the fundamental right to remain silent when the investigation is carried out. This essentially means that when the questions are posed before the accused person, a person has the right to remain silent and not to answer the questions which are posed to him. However, it is to be noted that a person who is accused can be questioned either during the investigation or the trial, and ultimately it is up to the accused whether to answer those questions or not. And please note that only the forced confession statements are not allowed by the accused person. However, if an accused wants to make any kind of voluntary confession, he is allowed to do so. However, the accused must make such voluntary confessions without any kind of inducement, threat or promise. And lastly, a person who is accused can also be compelled to give the thumb impression, blood specimens, etc., which may be necessary to carry out the investigation. Now, this particular article here highlights that custodial interrogation violates the fundamental rights of the accused as provided under Article 20 Clause 3 of the Indian Constitution. It is to be noted that the custodial interrogation basically pertains to arrest of a person solely for the purpose of carrying out the investigation. So this particular article highlights that if a person is arrested solely for the purpose of carrying out the interrogation by the police or any kind of law enforcement agencies, such kind of custodial interrogation violates the fundamental rights provided under Article 20 Clause 3 of the Indian Constitution. Now, as part of this video analysis, we'll understand as to why such fundamental right has been provided by the Indian Constitution, and we will also look at such rights provided by the other constitutions such as the US Constitution. Let us first understand as to why the Indian Constitution has provided for the right to remain silent. The police in India has the propensity to extract the confession statement from the accused by the usage of the third degree torture. Hence, in the absence of the fundamental right guaranteed under Article 20 Clause 3 of the Indian Constitution, the police would be able to extract the confession statement from an innocent person, and using such confession statement, the police would be able to implicate even the innocent persons as well. So the fundamental right provided under Article 20 Clause 3 of the Indian Constitution does not exist. Then the innocent persons can find themselves behind the bars and the criminals may be let off. And this can drastically undermine our criminal justice system. More importantly, the Supreme Court of India has highlighted that Article 20 Clause 3 of the Indian Constitution has been specifically been provided in order to police the police. Hence, it can be stated that Article 20 Clause 3 of the Indian Constitution safeguards the accused person from the undue harassment by the police officials. Further, in Selvi versus Karnataka, the Supreme Court of India has examined in detail the rationale for the right to remain silent, wherein the Supreme Court has highlighted that this particular right ensures the reliability of the statements made by the accused. This is because if the accused is forced to make false confession statements, such false confession statements may impact the overall integrity and outcome of the cases. On similar lines, the false statements made by the accused during the process of interrogation may cause undue delay and obstruction of justice. Now, with respect to custodial interrogation, as stated before, the custodial interrogation basically means that a person is solely arrested for purpose of carrying out interrogation, and hence the custodial interrogation violates the fundamental right of the person to remain silent. Now, this particular fundamental right of the person to remain silent has also been provided in US Constitution through the Fifth Amendment, wherein the Fifth Amendment basically seeks to impose a set of constitutional limits on the police action, and it has also provided a number of rights to the accused person. Some of these rights include prohibition on double jeopardy, which basically means that a person cannot be punished for the same offense more than once. And this particular fundamental right has also been provided under Article 20 Clause 2 of the Indian Constitution. Further, the Fifth Amendment in the US Constitution has also provided for the right against the forced self-incrimination, the right to remain silent, which is also famously known as the Miranda rights of the accused persons, and lastly, it has provided for a free and fair trial to all the criminals. Now, the next article appears on page number 1. The title of the article is Anthrax Scare at Assam's Pobitora Sanctuary after the death of 2 buffaloes. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection General Issues on Environmental Ecology. Now, this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because recently it has confirmed that the death of 2 Asiatic water buffaloes in the Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary has mainly caused due to the anthrax. Now, this raises grave concerns because Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary presently has the highest density of the one-horned rhinos. Now, with respect to location of Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary, please note that this particular wildlife sanctuary is located in the state of Assam along the banks of the Brahmaputra river. Apart from Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary, the other wildlife sanctuaries and national parks in the state of Assam include the Manas Wildlife Sanctuary, the Orang National Park, the Lakhawa Wildlife Sanctuary, Kaziranga National Park, the Gibbon Wildlife Sanctuary, and Dibru-Saikhowa National Park. The one-horned rhino is considered to be the largest of the rhino species, and presently it has been placed under the vulnerable category according to the IUCN classification. With respect to main sanctuaries of the one-horned rhino in India, it is located across multiple states such as Assam, West Bengal and UP. In state of Assam, it is mainly found in Kaziranga National Park, Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary, Orang National Park, Manas National Park, and in state of West Bengal, it is mainly found in Jaldapara National Park, Garumara National Park, and in state of UP, it is mainly found in Dudhwa Tiger Reserve. And in order to step up the conservation efforts for the one-horned rhino, the Government of India has launched the Indian Rhino Vision 2020. As per this particular vision, the government has envisaged to increase the rhino population to 3,000 by the end of 2020. Based upon a video analysis, these 4 questions shall be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answers to these 4 questions. We shall be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The first question here is, the following is a list of international or regional organizations that are often seen in news and their respective agendas. Which of these are correctly matched? The first one here is Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The agenda which is mentioned here is promotion of trade between the Central Asian countries. Now, this particular option here is wrong. This is because the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has been basically set up so as to promote the security cooperation among the member countries, and it is not aimed at promoting the trade cooperation. The second option reads as G33, safeguarding the interests of the developing countries in WTO. This particular option here is correct. The third option reads as G77. The agenda which is mentioned here is Coalition of Developing Countries at United Nations. Even this particular option here is correct. So basically G77 is a group of developing nations so as to protect their interests at the United Nations Forum. And the fourth option which is mentioned here is basic, and the agenda accordingly which is mentioned here is climate change. And as we have discussed, basic is a grouping of countries including Brazil, South Africa, India and China, which has been set up in order to protect the interests of the developing countries in the climate change negotiations. So looking at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question shall be C, that is 2, 3 and 4. Now coming to second question, the question here is consider following statements related to the green crackers. The first statement here is the green crackers must be able to completely eliminate the emission of the particulate matter. Now this particular statement here is wrong. This is because the green crackers are required to reduce the emission of the particulate matter by 33 to 35%. The second statement reads as the manufacturing licenses for the green crackers is issued by the Central Pollution Control Board. Now even this particular option here is wrong. This is because the manufacturing licenses for the green crackers is issued by the Petroleum and Explosive Safety Organization. So if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question shall be D, that is neither 1 nor 2. Now coming to third question, the question here is which of the fundamental rights have been provided to the persons who have been accused of certain criminal offences under the Article 20 of the Indian Constitution. The options which are given here are no ex post facto law, no double jeopardy, and the third one is right against self-incrimination. Now all of these rights have been provided under Article 20 of the Indian Constitution, and hence the answer to this question shall be D, that is 1, 2 and 3. Now coming to last question, the question here is consider the following statements related to one-horned rhino. The first statement here is it has been placed under the critically endangered species as per the IUCN classification. Now this statement here is wrong. This is because the one-horned rhino has been placed under the vulnerable category according to the IUCN classification. The second statement reads as the one-horned rhino is confined only to the state of Assam. Even this particular statement is wrong, as we have discussed that the one-horned rhino is also found in the states of West Bengal as well as UP. So accordingly, the correct answer to this particular question shall be D, that is neither 1 nor 2. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us have a look at the question for the day.